Okay, let's just start with a number, a truly staggering number. 29 million. That's right, 29 million Italians left their home over about a century. I mean, that's nearly the entire population of Italy when it first became a country. This wasn't just, a few people moving. It was a full-blown exodus. It literally created a second Italy, scattered all across the world. So let's dig into how and maybe more importantly, why this all happened.
This whole story really starts with a feeling of just pure dread. Seriously, just try to imagine this. You've been on a ship for weeks. You've gone through what this person calls every color of hell. And you step onto land, not to a welcome party, but to what feels like a trial. This quote you see here from a migrant, it just perfectly captures that terror, that uncertainty. It's a powerful reminder that behind these huge numbers, these statistics, there are millions of individual people with their own stories of hope and, well, a whole lot of fear.
So to really get why 29 million people would risk everything, we have to go back. We have to look at the Italy they were so desperate to get away from. Because this was not the romantic Italy of art and pasta that we picture today. Now, this was a nation in deep, deep crisis.
Okay, get ready for a number that's, well, it's hard to even wrap your head around. The average life expectancy back then? 30. Just 30 years old. To give you some perspective, the entire country's economy, its GDP, was on par with some of the absolute poorest nations on Earth today. We're not just talking about being poor here. This was a day-in, day-out struggle just to stay alive.
And this is just gut-wrenching. Think about what this says about the future of a country. 1 out of every 3 babies born in Italy wouldn't even make it to their first birthday. 1 in 3. This kind of reality, this constant loss, it fuels a level of desperation that's hard for us to imagine. And here are the final pieces of this grim puzzle. 4 out of 5 Italians couldn't read or write. 4 out of 5. And on top of that, 40% of the entire population was living in what we'd call absolute poverty. So you've got no education, no real opportunity, and for millions, absolutely no hope for a better life, at least not if they stayed.
So you take all those factors, you mix them together, and you get this, the Great Migration. We're talking about a 100-year period, from the late 1800s all the way to the 1970s. This relentless wave of people leaving created, as one source so perfectly put it, another Italy outside of Italy. The scale is it's almost beyond comprehension.
So what was the recipe for this exodus? Well, you had the push factors, a population boom in the countryside that nobody could support, a terrible agricultural crisis, and pretty much no factory jobs to speak of. Then you had the pull factors, the promise of free land in places like the United States, and these newfangled steamships that, for the very first time, made it possible, though not easy, for an ordinary person to cross an ocean. It was truly the perfect storm. Now, deciding to leave was one thing. Surviving the journey was another entirely. This wasn't a cruise. Let's talk about the brutal, brutal reality of what it was like to make that crossing. Just picture it. You're crammed into the bottom of an old ship, in the dark, with no air, for weeks. The water you have to drink is foul. The food is barely edible. And diseases like cholera could rip through the ship in a matter of days. A lot of people who sold every last thing they owned to buy that ticket, they never even saw their destination. They died at sea. And for the ones who did survive the trip, the nightmare wasn't over. Welcome to Ellis Island. First up was a humiliating medical exam. They were looking for things like trachoma, a nasty eye infection. And if you had it, you were out. About 15% of people were filtered out right there. Then came the questions. You got money? You got a job lined up? You know anybody here? Give the wrong answer, and you could be stuck in quarantine or, in the most heartbreaking cases, put right back on a ship to Italy. But okay, let's say you make it through Ellis Island. You're in. That's when a whole new battle begins. Because for many, the promised land turned out to be a place of vicious prejudice, exploitation, and just straight-up racism. And here's where things get really ugly. You see how language itself became a weapon. Take a slur like WAP. A lot of people think it stood for without papers, but some sources trace it back to a Neapolitan word, guapo, which means something like a thug or a bully. Then you have dago, which literally comes from the word dagger. The message was clear. These people are violent, they're criminals. These weren't just schoolyard insults, you guys. They were tools designed to dehumanize an entire population. And this wasn't just an American thing. This hatred was global. In Germany, they were called spaghettifresser, spaghetti eaters. In France, they were rattle, making fun of their accent, or crispy, which meant thief. In Australia, the slur wogue literally meant virus. In Brazil, colono burro, donkey farmer was meant to call them stupid. The list goes on and on. It was a worldwide language of hate.
And the media just poured gasoline on the fire. This is a famous cartoon from 1903. Look at it. It's called The Unrestricted Dumping Ground. It doesn't show people. It shows rats scurrying off a ship. And what's on their little hats? Words like mafia, anarchy, assassin. This is how you cement a dangerous stereotype in the minds of millions. And don't think for a second this was just some fringe opinion. This way of thinking went all the way to the top. Years later, that's a direct quote from Richard Nixon, a president of the United States, caught on tape talking about Italian Americans. It's just a shocking look at how deep these prejudices really ran.
And all this hate, it wasn't just words and pictures. It had brutal, real-world consequences. Italians got the most dangerous jobs, working on railways and in mines, often for less money than anyone else. They were packed into filthy, overcrowded apartments. Their kids were often forced to work. They faced actual mob violence, like in 1891 when a mob in New Orleans lynched 11 Italians. They were even targeted by bogus science that claimed, I kid you not, that 79% of them were feeble-minded. It was relentless.
But this story is not just about hardship. It's also a story of incredible resilience and transformation. Because these immigrants didn't just survive. In the end, they fundamentally reshaped the world they came to and, believe it or not, the country they left behind.
So first off, where did they all end up? Well, during that peak period before World War I, it was pretty much a 50-50 split. Almost 8 million people made that terrifying journey across the ocean to places like the US, Argentina, and Brazil. But a huge number, over 6.5 million, also stayed in Europe, finding work in countries like France, Switzerland, and Germany.
Now this is really fascinating. Take a look at this chart. It shows where in Italy people were leaving from. Early on in the late 1800s, it was mostly a northern thing. But then, look what happens right after 1900. That line for the South just explodes upwards. The agricultural crisis was hitting the South the hardest, and suddenly, the typical Italian immigrant looked very different.
And this right here shows the single biggest impact they had on Italy itself. It all came down to one thing: remittances. The money they sent home. It was an absolute economic lifeline. In just about a decade, they sent back over 5 billion lira. That was almost 3% of Italy's entire GDP. And get this, by 1920, over 60% of all the money in Italian postal savings accounts came from immigrants. Just incredible. And this money wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It changed Italian society. Families could finally pay off their debts. They could buy their very first piece of land. They could fix up their homes. But the most important thing it did? It let them send their kids to school. In a strange way, Italy's biggest export, its own people, became its greatest asset, fueling the very modernization that led to its economic boom after the war.
So we end up right back where we started, with a human story. A story about people who were poor, desperate, and couldn't read or write. They were called criminals. They were called stupid. They were called undesirables, who would ruin any country they entered. And yet, they built new lives, new communities, and new futures. So the sources really leave us with one big question. How does remembering their story, a story that for so many of us is our own family's story, change how we think and talk about the immigrants who are arriving on our shores today?
Un numero davvero sbalorditivo. 29 milioni. Sì,